Coach, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Thanks so much for making time out of your busy day to get on here and talk with me. I've always looked up to you, read a lot of things you've written, so it'd be great to pick your brain for a little bit.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
Awesome. Well, this is recording live, and I can definitely send you guys a copy as well, so you'll have it and you can refer back to it if you
Okay.
find it useful as well. But if you're ready, we'll dive on in.
I'm ready.
All right, Coach. Well, you've been coaching at North Carolina now for quite some time, and so the very first thing I want to kind of tap into is just asking you what has been the biggest influence on your coaching philosophy, or who has had the biggest influence in how you coach over that time period.
Yeah, unquestionably, I would say it was Dean Smith. When I was a young coach, what was really cool is Coach Smith used to invite me to watch his practices. And I couldn't believe how organized they were. I mean, everyone was accountable. And what was amazing is seeing all these assistant managers scattered around the floor, watching them gather data for these kids that were training right in front of Coach Smith. And what was really neat is you'd see all these different exercises. At the end of the training session, you would see all these assistant managers scattered around the floor, sprint to the scores table. And right there, the head manager would compile that day's practice data. At the end of practice, you would see Dean addressing the troops, and he'd finish his talk. And by this time, the head manager would have sorted it out. He'd turn around right behind him. The head manager would give Coach Smith a ranking of that day's practice performance. I was thinking, this is unbelievable. So talk about immediate feedback. Practice is over. They've already assembled the data while Dean is, finishing up some remarks with his team, and then bang, he reads out, 1 through 12 or 1 through 15, however many kids he has in his roster that year, a ranking of that day's practice performance. And I would imagine that the elements in it are their shooting percentage for the day, probably their free throw shooting percentage as well, maybe their 3-point percentage, and all these different things blended together, whether they boxed out in a rebound or failed to, if they're involved in a 5-on-5 scrimmage with the reserve team, what was the plus minus in that? And obviously, I don't know enough about basketball to think of all the different things that they would record, but all of the data that Coach Smith considered critical in order to drive performance with his team. And then the accountability and the immediacy of the accountability, I just thought was just incredible. So we took this stuff, we soccerized it, we took it to a completely different level. We call this thing the competitive cauldron. And those of you that have read my books and followed our program, and this is a cornerstone for our success. I believe that if you want to become an elite athlete, part of what's going to drive you to your best potential is for you to compete all the time. Certainly compete in practice, compete in matches. And I think this competition is what produces excellence. But the other thing I think measures into your ultimate success as an elite player is to know all the elements that are critical for you to compete at the highest level. So we've got between 19 and 28 different categories that you compete in on an annual basis. Certainly things that any athlete would understand: acceleration, vertical jump, agility, the beep, which measures your aerobic conditioning, 30-meter sprints, difference between the first time and the last time in 7 sprints, measures your anaerobic fitness. And so all these elements that you certainly would understand when you're measuring an athlete. But then we mix in all the soccer things. We play 5 different one-on-one ladders. We've got heading ladders. Obviously, we have finishing percentages. We have number of goals scored in practice, and all the different elements that you can assemble every time you're involved in a 3v3 event, 4v4, 5v5, 6v6, 7v7, 8v8, 9v9, even 11v11. If you win and lose, you now have a winning percentage. And what we try to sort out is who is the margin of victory, who is driving performance, who's the albatross, who's the person you don't want on your roster if you want to try to win this 4-on-4. And there's this social but also obviously personal pressure that you put on yourself to climb the ladders. At the end of every practice, we assemble the data. By the next practice, on a bulletin board within easy side of the field is everyone's ranking in every single category. And you'll see these kids before practice. They'll go by the bulletin board and see where they are. At the end of the year, we get all these different categories together, and then we give sort of a final report card on their practice performance for the year. And that's the competitive cauldron. All the kids have a measure of where they're strong, where they're weak, and all these different elements that we consider critical to evaluate player performance, but also the areas we want to see them improving in through the course of their 4 years are a part of this platform. So I think Dean Smith and his influence on me, and certainly on that side, the practice performance side, but also, honestly, the way he respected everyone that was a part of his organization, from, the Michael Jordan superstar. Obviously, he's Michael Jordan's college coach, to the lowliest freshman manager that was, picking up towels and moving cones in practice. So what we also all learned from him here, which is a part of the North Carolina athletic culture, is respect for the student athletes that you're either coaching or they're a part of your organization. And so these things all were very, very important to me as a young coach. And he was an extraordinarily significant mentor, so much so that he would always humble himself in front of us at every opportunity. I can remember once, just to show you how he pays his respect forward, we were hiring a football coach, I think. And I think this was in a press conference after a basketball he had played, maybe in Chicago. And the press asked him, well, coach, this is going to be difficult. You're hiring a new football coach. Isn't it always a challenge to hire a football coach at a basketball school? And Dean's line was just classic. It was classic Dean Smith. He said, we're not a basketball school. We're a women's soccer school. So here he was. And of course, that was a quote that I still see in descriptions of my program. This great man humbling himself to claim that we are something other than a basketball school. And of course, we're not a women's soccer school. We are a basketball school. But he wanted to, help us in any way he could, help our recruiting. And this was one of the thousands of different gestures he extended our way. And so my affection and respect for the man, but also the things I learned from him, are just without precedent. And I would say my mentor, even though he's not a soccer coach, is Coach Dean Smith at the University of North Carolina.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And so I want to touch on the competitive Cauldron a little bit more. Obviously, that's been a great tool for your team in instilling a very competitive culture. How has it changed from when you first implemented it till now? Are you guys using it in the same way, or has it kind of evolved over time?
Actually, it has evolved. And I had an opportunity at this NSCA convention to talk about the Cauldron. The foundation, the NSCA Foundation, which is sponsoring coaching education for the NSCAA and trying to assemble an endowment for that wonderful organization, invited me to give two presentations. One of them was a lecture, which I gave on Thursday afternoon. The other one was actually a field session, which I gave on Saturday afternoon. In the lecture session, they asked me to do something on the competitive Cauldron, so I did. And so what I talked about was the evolution of the competitive Cauldron, because originally, those of you that have read Training Soccer Champions, my first book, that was published, I think, in the early to mid 90s, there's a whole chapter on the competitive Cauldron. And what's interesting, if I go back to that book, I think we only had 9 competitive categories that we were recording in practice. Well, now I think we're up to 28 competitive categories. And so this platform has certainly evolved. The principle has not changed. And I think sometimes people take the Cauldron and misinterpret the value of it. The value of it is threefold. First of all, it drives performance in practice. If every player knows that everything matters in practice, they're going to be driven by this understanding that they can't take time off in practice. That if they slack off and lose or don't compete as effectively or aren't finishing as well or aren't serving as accurately or sprinting as hard, that's going to be measured, and that'll be a factor into their evaluation of the competitive Cauldron. So it's data driving practice performance. The other thing I absolutely love about it is the feedback it gives a player immediately. They can look the next day and see how they did. And then, of course, at the end of the year, they've got an overall evaluation of things they need to work on. So I think the evaluation factor is also critical. But the other thing that has huge value for me, and I'll be doing some of this today, is the value it has in a player conference. Because now one of the worst things about your classic employer-employee evaluation is the sort of negative aspects of the evaluation, because all of us want to try to drive our players, or if you're a businessman, your employees, to their potential. One of the hard things about the evaluation is the subjectivity of it. And here's the way a player that doesn't have a lot of confidence and self-belief will evaluate a critique, especially if it's subjective. Oh, the coach just doesn't like me. And so now basically they leave the player conference not filled with hope and ambition because the coach has just shredded all the different aspects of their game that need evaluating and improving. And it's not the way I wanted my kids to leave the player evaluation. I wanted them to leave on a high, to be excited about getting their potential and to sort of get after it. And so now what happens with this data we've accumulated is it's me and the player actually against the numerical data. And that's a very good way to evaluate someone's, because now you're sitting there with your player, basically sitting across from the data, and you're saying, you know what? I think you're better than this. I think these numbers right here do not reflect who you are or what your potential is. And now their ears are open because it's you and player against the data. And now you're saying, you know what, I think you can improve in this area. You know, what did you do in the summer in preparation for this? And they would say, I did this, this, and this. Well, maybe we should do a little bit more of this. Or did you skip that? Or, you know, can you try this? And the coolest thing about the player conference now is you're allied with your player against their weaknesses. And so this tool that you're actually using to drive performance, this tool that you've actually designed, is now you're making it seem like it's something you've had nothing to do with. You can't believe that's out there, but here's the way we're going to attack it. So even though this tool is your evaluation of the player, because you designed the tool, you're assembling the data for it, and you're presenting it to them, even though all those elements are there, and this is your evaluation of them, it doesn't seem like that in the player conference. What it seems like in the player conference is it's you and the player against the data. So now they think that they've got this incredible ally in this fight against mediocrity. And who's this ally? Well, it's your coach. Your coach is dying for you to somehow attain your potential. And here are all the pieces you've got to do, you know, more effectively for you to sort of climb the ladders to be, you know, in the top 10 on the team in this sort of evaluation. And a mistake a lot of people have made in the past when they look at the competitive Cauldron, they think I use the Cauldron to pick my starting lineup. I don't. I don't need the Cauldron to tell me who I should play and how many minutes I should play them. But because we've been doing this Cauldron for so long, it's remarkable how it spits out my starting lineup almost to the player. And it's also amazing how the players that climb into the top 4 and ultimately ascend to number 1 are the kids that are reigning world champions. Lori Kolupny, world champion, 2015, climbed to number 1 in the competitive Cauldron. Megan Klingenberg, world champion, climbed to number 1 in the competitive Cauldron. Whitney Engen, a world champion, climbed at number 1 in the competitive Cauldron. We could go through almost the whole battery of UNC players that ascended onto the U.S. Olympic and full national team, and you can see their climb through the competitive Cauldron. So there's so much evidence that this makes a huge difference for our kids. It really helps us drive performance in practice.
Absolutely. And so then I guess one of the questions I have to ask you is, how do you define competition? What is your definition of that word, and what does it mean?
Well, I think it's you're trying to win. You're trying to basically prove that you're better than this person. You're more effective at getting a result. You are basically striving, in effect, to get to your potential. And what's driving you is are the players around you that are fighting you to keep you off the top dog spot on the team in this aspect of the competition. If it's a 3v3, they're preventing you from scoring the goal. They're trying to blow by you to score the goal themselves. I mean, all these different elements are a part of what's critical in competition. And I think that's the core of it. You're fighting against the people around you to demonstrate to everyone that you're the absolute best.
Absolutely. And so I just want to make sure I'm hearing you right there, because the Cauldron serves as a way to compare the girls, but not so that they can say, that comparison pushes them to be better internally. So it promotes an internal competition almost because of the external data that you give the girls, correct?
Correct. I mean, that's exactly what we want to do. And what we've noticed, again, is what I just shared, is it's stunning how the kids that fight their way to the top of the Cauldron are the ones that end up, signing pro contracts, winning world championships, playing for the U.S. full team, the U.S. Olympic team. And it's a perfect reflection of the value of competition.
Absolutely. And then as a whole, by and large, how do your girls respond to the rankings, to the Cauldron being used? Is it something that they hate it as a freshman and come to love it as a senior? Or what kind of relationship do they have with that?
There is a transition, and my favorite story is the Carla Worden-Overbeck story. When we recruited Carla, we had just lost our entire defense, and she was a center back, and we started her freshman year. So in my opinion, she was certainly one of my 10 best players. But what was interesting in practice, Carla's such a sweet kid. She was reluctant to beat anyone in practice. And so just to sort of befriend everyone and to have everyone wrap their arms around her and embrace her, she did the classical female thing, which is she wanted to be liked as opposed to being respected. And so the transition for her into my culture was not an easy one. Her freshman year, she spent most of her time genuflecting to her teammates, not really competing with them. We have these 5 different one-on-one ladders. What was amazing is this starter for me didn't win one 1v1 competition in our 5 different one-on-one ladders. And that, of course, is ridiculous because anyone that's going to be a starting player is certainly going to win her share of one-on-one competitions, if not against some of the other starters, at a minimum against the reserve players she's playing against. And yet her freshman year, she didn't win one 1v1 game. Her senior year, she didn't lose a game. So somewhere between her freshman and her senior year, she decided she was going to go after it. In fact, there's this great quote that we found in a newspaper article when she was being interviewed by this guy that saw her transformation from, a meek freshman starter to this velociraptor by the time she was a senior. And what she told the reporter about this transition into this, competitive warrior was she was sick and tired of seeing her name on the bottom of a list. So basically what happened is our data collection and our public posting gave her permission to go after it. So that's a great example of someone that used the data to basically decide that this was okay. Obviously, this is a culture that embraces people that compete. Can I compete? Yes, everyone can compete. And so it encouraged her to lift herself up off the bottom and aspire to go to the top.
Absolutely. And so I'm sure that you've had multiple players that have shown you great things through their practice, through their commitment. Can you think of what's been the most positive or the most powerful display that you've seen a player do in a practice or training session?
Well, we can use a million different examples, but I'm going to use a recent one because of her spectacular performance in this recent World Cup. When we recruited Megan Klingenberg to come play for us at the University of North Carolina, we knew we had a very good player. She was actively recruited by some other of the outstanding schools in the country. So it wasn't like this was a girl that came in without a good platform. She came in with an excellent platform. But an element missing in her evolution was this constant desire to compete the whole time. But what really happened to her very quickly in her freshman year is she sorted out that if she was going to have an impact, she was going to make a difference by competing in every single practice. And I still use her right now with my current team because of her visibility. And the thing Klingenberg brought to every single practice from her freshman year forward was this desire to be the absolute best. She played absolutely as fast as she could, right on the edge of her fitness. And it was just fantastic watching her play. And her transition every single year, she just kept getting better and better and better. And I just loved her evolution as a player. So here's an example of a kid that sort of completely embraced the climate, but came in maybe a little bit shy, maybe a little bit less aggressive. But by the time she graduated, she had full buy-in, and she was absolutely the best player on the team. I think when she came in, she was certainly a very good player when she arrived. I think she was number maybe 8, 9, or 10, or 11 on the Cauldron. But by the time she graduated, she was number 1. And you can see with her national team career what's happened. She made all-world first 11. And for anyone to be honored in a World Cup as one of the best players in the entire World Cup is a credit to them. And I attribute Megan Klingenberg's training attitude as to the reason why she impressed so many people in the world.
Absolutely. Can you think of one specific example when you first saw her demonstrate that, or that absolutely blew you away whenever you were watching her play and you thought, this is what she's doing and this is why I love her as a player?
Actually, it wasn't even in a soccer practice. it was in some sort of recreational field day above Fetzer Field. We've got a series of intramural fields, and this was sort of like some sort of Olympic competition. All athletes on campus were invited to compete in all these different things, and they certainly did some things that we might test a soccer player with, some sort of agility challenge back and forth. But they also had this fabulous sumo wrestling thing where these girls got in these massive sumo outfits with these large poles with huge pillows on the end. And then the idea was to try to push your opponent out of the, sumo ring like a sumo wrestler would. But the thing that the weapon they got, in addition to obviously their blown up bodies with these fat suits on, they had these massive sticks. And Klingenberg is a tiny little thing. I mean, she's not a very tall player, and she's certainly not very big, maybe 5'2", 5'3", 5'4", I can't remember. And she was matched up with some massive women. I mean, 5'10" women, girls that outweighed her by 30, 40, 50 pounds. And obviously she knew that for her to, push one of these larger kids out of the sumo ring, she would have to sort of demonstrate this incredible gift of fury. And I'm watching this, and I was immensely entertained because you would see her just charge the other monster and just start pummeling her with this, this stick and shoving her out of the ring. And I was just stunned. She beat everyone to a pulp, and she may have been the smallest athlete in the ring every time I watched her compete. And that told me about her competitive fire, but also her wonderful gift of fury. She was an extraordinary competitor.
Absolutely. And so in addition to that competitive fire, what else makes up a great player?
Well, obviously, the way we look at it, in the old days, I used to just look at talent and recruit talent, thinking that I could transform, people that lacked self-discipline or lacked, competitive fire or lacked self-belief. But now I've learned through trial and error that if you had a choice between picking an incredibly talented player and one that had extraordinary self-discipline, competitive fire, and self-belief that was lacking some talent, you would pick that one. There is nothing more critical than those three platforms for taking a kid not just to her potential, but beyond it. And there's also nothing more compromising for an incredibly talented player than for them to lack self-discipline, to lack some competitive fire, and to lack confidence or self-belief. And so this was a long time coming because obviously all of us in our coaching arrogance think that we can take this amazingly talented player and transform her into these great players that we obviously trained before. And all of us that are involved in coaching have several stories of a kid that came in at one level and then left the program or our environment at a completely different level. And so that's the way we feed our own self-belief. And so as a result, I think we developed this attitude that, we can do anything with any player. And it's not true. I mean, the players that ultimately make it at the highest level, even though hopefully some of us have contributed in some way to their evolution, I've been humbled because now I certainly understand that the ones that ultimately make it, 90 to 95% of the reason is them. They've got this thing that is driving them inside them, that's making all the difference in the world. And it's those three platforms. It's their ability to wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to get after it. I'm going to get better today. So this driven, athlete with incredible self-discipline. And then the competitive fire, as we talked about with the Cauldron. I'm sick and tired of seeing my name on the bottom of a list, Carla Warden Overbeck. I'm going to start climbing this list. So she goes from never winning to never losing in 4 years. So that evolution is also critical. And then the other thing is confidence is such a shattering element in athletics. And great confidence doesn't shatter you. It's the lack of it which does. And all of us have seen, phenomenal athletes that lack confidence and they don't perform to their potential. And we've seen very average athletes, because of confidence, just overachieve. And I think those three things are the most critical things. And I've learned a lot in the last 40 plus years coaching. And now if I had a choice, I'd pick those three qualities over talent.
Absolutely. So you mentioned there 2 times, Coach, that you've learned as you've gone on. What lesson have you learned in your coaching career that's taken you the longest to learn?
Let's see. I guess that the most critical element that you should coach all the time is character. One of my favorite moments in sport was Amos Alonzo Stagg, the famous football coach at the University of Chicago. This is back in the early 1900s. His football team had just won a national championship, and I can't remember if it was 1915 or 1918, but somewhere back there. This reporter walked up to him right after his team had won and said, "Hey, coach, what do you think of your team?" And his answer is the best answer I think any of us could give the coach. He said, "I'll tell you in 20 years." And it's a fantastic answer, because what he understood is this ephemeral championship that he just won wasn't going to really make a difference in his life or the lives of the kids he was coaching. But hopefully something they learned along the way, and their experiences playing under him or in this team or among a collection of national champions, is something they could benefit from 20 years down the road when their full character was in full display. So I think that was the hardest lesson for me to learn, because as a young coach, I thought everything was about X's and O's. Everything was about your training platforms. Everything was about that sort of thing. And so what I tried to master as a young coach was becoming knowledgeable about my game, being better at, trapping, passing, or coaching, trapping, passing, shooting, dribbling, and heading, being better with the X's and O's, being better in systems of play and playing through the line, and all the different elements of coaching. But now what I understand in spades is the most critical thing I can do for the kids I'm training is to help them evolve in terms of their character over the course of the 4 years they're spending with me. And
how do you do that?
Again, because of this, this competitive Cauldron thing and this data-driven, we have 12 core values. And again, this is a long time learning how to effectively implement the culture I wanted. And I tried all sorts of things. I mean, I've read all these great business books, and all the business books were telling me that what's critical is that you develop a culture of principle-centered living, a culture of effective core values, and players that live their core values. And so for years, I had these unbelievably mundane and dust-dry platitudes of what I expected from my environment. And one of the great platitudes of all time, of course, is, we work hard. So that's a part of our, if you're a businessman, your corporate culture, and obviously it's a part of any athletic culture. But there's nothing inspirational about that. I mean, to make some statement like that, as if you can make that statement and have a player read it and have the player go, "Oh my gosh, that's what it is. I've got to work hard. My gosh, thanks, coach, for sharing this with me. What a wonderful insight. That's what I was missing. I never worked hard. So thank goodness I came here and I've now learned that I have to work hard." I mean, these are platitudes and there's nothing inspirational about them. And I'm thinking this just is not working. And trust me, I'm one of these guys that tries 60,000 different things every year to, try to help my team get to its potential. And this culture just wasn't moving the way I wanted it to. Not that we didn't have good teams, not that there weren't some things we were doing that was good, but this just didn't really seem to be working. Then all of a sudden I'm reading in the New York Times Magazine, this Columbia graduate student in Russian literature is talking about her years at Columbia, getting her PhD in Russian literature. And she talks about this Russian exile poet by the name of Joseph Brodsky that Columbia hires to bring in to educate all of them. And he gets all of his PhD candidates together early in the semester, and he says, I would like for you guys to memorize all of this Russian literature and Russian poetry. And these PhD candidates get together following this introduction to Professor Brodsky, and they say, this guy's nuts. He's obviously, spent too many hours in the Siberian winter. I mean, something's wrong with his brain. I don't think he understands the way a PhD is treated in the American academic culture. let's get together and educate him on where he is now, because he's no longer, in some frozen wasteland. He is at Columbia, one of the great universities in the world. So get together, they go storming into his office, and Professor Brodsky, I'm sorry, you obviously don't understand our culture. This is for elementary school children in this country. We don't memorize this. This is not for us. You have to teach us a different way. So Professor Brodsky said, well, okay, if you guys don't memorize this, none of you guys get your PhDs. So they all left the office with their tail firmly tucked between their legs, and they decided they're going to memorize this. And here's this woman writing the article, and she's saying all of a sudden, for the first time in her life, even though this has been her dream to be an expert in Russian literature and Russian poetry, she started to feel the poetry. And why did she feel it? She felt it because now she had memorized it. It was a part of her cerebral fabric. And now for the first time in conversation she would have about this literature and this poetry she was studying, she could reference it so easily. Why? Because she had memorized it. So now all of a sudden she was reciting blocks of this stuff that really resonated with her, and it completely transformed her opinion of Russian literature, and it became a part of her fabric. So I'm thinking, you know what? Nothing else has worked. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all of my core values. I'm going to attach a motivational quote to it. My kids are going to memorize these quotes. And that's what we did. So one of our core values is we don't whine. So what do the kids memorize? They memorize George Bernard Shaw's quote about to be a force of fortune instead of a feverish, selfish little club of ailments and grievances, complaining the world will not devote itself to making you happy. And that's a much more motivational statement about not whining. I love words. I think words have power. And the quotes that we've picked that are attached to all of our core values, I think have huge power. So here's what happens. We have these 12 core values. We expect our girls to live them. We expect our girls to memorize them. The freshmen memorize 3, the sophomores 3, the juniors 3, the seniors 3. And then twice a year, all of the girls evaluate each other against each of the 12 core values. And we set it up like a grade point average. If they're an extraordinary example of these core values, you give them an A, which is a 4. If they live this core value most of the time, it's a B, you give them a 3. If they occasionally live this core value, you give them a 2. If they rarely live this core value, you give them a 1. If they're the worst example on the team of this core value, you give them a 0. You're allowed to pick 1 0. If they're the best example on the team of this core value, give them a 5. You're allowed to give 1 5. And so now what they get from their teammates is an evaluation of how they're living all 12 core values. So between them memorizing it and this peer pressure to live it, because when I meet with them in their player conferences, I show them the top 4 kids in the team and what their grades were and all their core values. And then I show them their line of where they are in their core values. And we want them to live above a 3.0 in terms of all of their core values. But also we expect them to be above a 3.0 in each core value. And if they drop below it, then we have to address it, and we do. And it's all about, again, character development and expectation. So that's the way we sort of drive character, again, using, in a way, a competitive cauldron. And then the other thing we do to emphasize how critical this is to us is at our banquet, our annual banquet after the season, the top award you can win at the University of North Carolina is not the most valuable player award. It's the Kelly Muldoon Award for character, which is the highest GPA in the 12 core values on the roster. And then that girl has this wonderful full-body portrait of her hung outside the McCaskill Soccer Center on a big canvas sail, because that's what we honor here. We honor character over soccer development.
Awesome. I think that's fantastic. And it's really cool to hear all the different ways that you're measuring and evaluating things you do care about. I think that speaks volumes to the girls, I'm sure, within the program. I want to move now, Coach, to talking about coaching on the field, coaching in practice. You said in Training Soccer Champions that if you have to yell at players from the sidelines, you haven't coached them, but rather that coaching is all about having an effect. Can you talk a little bit about how you structure your practices so that there is an actual effect from your teaching to game day?
Yeah, what's cool is we have so many phenomenal examples out there of people that we can reference easily, certainly now with the internet and our ability to pull up anything on our phones. When I was a young coach, in addition to, sort of learning at the feet of Dean Smith, I would read all of John Wooden's stuff. And what's interesting about studying John Wooden is his practice demeanor was like a machine gun. He would be constantly, with short bursts, share nuggets of information. And they were instructional. He wasn't a cheerleader, although he was certainly a positive human being. But almost everything he said in practice was designed to get this player to do a certain thing a certain way. And he wouldn't have lectures during practice. He would actually, during the run of play, during the actual practice session itself, he would have these little pieces of information for all the kids that he was training. And I think that's the way to impact on human development in your sport and practice, is to almost be like a nag the whole practice, to say what you want, certainly to encourage the right thing. So if someone did something right, you're also letting them know, hey, that was fantastic. And the reason that was fantastic, be specific in your instruction, was because you did it so quickly. All of a sudden now we've come out on the other side of the field because that change of point was just like a dream. And I tell you, earlier you helped us because you changed the point directly. And all of a sudden we're on the other side with no time wasted. I'll tell you, this is making a difference. So you're spending the whole practice reinforcing in short bursts of information why that was so good. And then also correcting, again, with short bursts of information, how this can be improved. And I think anyone that studied all the greats, one of the classics to study would be John Wooden. There's so much information out there, and this little piece of information is something that all of us have access to.
Absolutely. And so then let's talk about when a player is not doing what they need to do. Maybe they're making mistakes. Obviously, there's multiple reasons why mistakes happen. How do you judge when you need to step in and give feedback, or when you let that player self-correct and correct themselves?
Well, that's a wonderful question, because every player is different. Every player needs to be coached differently. Every player has a different conduit into changing her or him. And you've got to find that conduit. A part of what's going to help change them, and a part of what's going to help you become a better coach for that player, is for that player ultimately to trust you. So again, a part of this relationship you're developing with each player is this sort of exchange of mutual respect and trust. And there are 1,000 different ways you're trying to do this. The players need to know you care about them. I remember one of our core values is one of my players, a girl by the name of Raquel Carvelson, left this note on my desk, and it's a Roosevelt quote, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's a fabulous, it was a fabulous reminder for me that somehow with Raquel, I had lost my connection with her. And so obviously that brought me back to homeostasis, and so I tried to correct it as fast as I could. But all of us should be constantly investing in these relationships with the players that we're coaching and training. And then you have to figure out what that conduit is. Some players are virtually uncoachable. And then you have to decide how you are going to move them. And I can, get back to the famous Bobby Knight quote about there's no better coach than the bench. If you're telling her again and again and again to do this and they're not doing it, you basically sit them down and say, you know what, for some reason you're just not getting this. So I'm going to place so-and-so in your place now because for some reason you just can't do this. So is there a reason why you can't do this or why you're not doing this? And oh, no, I can do this. Well, I said, I've put you out there, you're in the middle of your freshman year. I've started you from the first game and this just isn't happening. So I'm going to try someone else out. And trust me, if they master it, you're going to be sitting here for quite a while. But who knows, I might put you back in, maybe even in this game. Do you think you can possibly manage this? And so obviously that's the extreme. The bench is the extreme. But you got to figure out what conduit is going to get to the player. Maybe a verbal correction doesn't get through. Maybe it has to be demonstrated to them. So maybe basically a physical demonstration of what you want will get it through. Maybe a part of the issue as to why they're not doing this is because some coach they had at an earlier level basically thought the way they were doing it was the absolute best way. So you're fighting a tradition that's a part of this player's fabric, and you've got to sort of break that down. So there are all these different things that you have to sort out with every player you're coaching. And a lot of this, obviously, you're going to do as you get to know the player. And you can even ask them. You can say, you know what, getting back to the yelling thing you and I were talking about earlier from the sideline, maybe you even talk to the player, how do you want me to coach you during a game? If you're making a mistake, do you want to hear from the sideline? Because here's the problem with hearing from the sideline. It's going to sound like I'm screaming at you. Why is it going to sound like I'm screaming at you? Because the field is 75 yards wide and 120 yards long, and I can't use my indoor voice to let you know that you've got to change this aspect of your performance. So what's going to sound like is I'm screaming at you. Hey, you got to balance, and you're going to sense from the tone that I'm angry with you. I'm not angry with you. I'm just sharing information with you. But what you're going to sense is that I'm upset. I'm not upset, but it's the only way I can get the information across the field. So what do you want me to do? Do you want me to sub you out and speak to you in an indoor voice, or do you have the resilience for me to scream across the field and let you know this is what I need you to correct? What do you choose? And of course, what does every player choose?
Stay on the field.
Yeah, I want to stay on the field. But you can see them just, melting right in front of you when you're trying to instruct them from across, 75 yards. And it just doesn't seem to do much for their confidence. But at least what you're trying to do is you're trying to let them know that this is the way I have to communicate with you. If you're making a mistake constantly that has to be corrected, I have one of two choices. You either correct it or I have to take you out. And so now, again, these are all different buttons that you've got to learn to push the coach to try to drive the kid to their potential. But honestly, the best thing is getting to know them, getting them to trust you, and then finding out how they want the information delivered.
Sure. And so I want to keep going with that same idea and that same thought then, talking about practice, talking about instruction. Mm-hmm. How much do you give verbal instruction during practice as opposed to creating a drill or game that teaches the skill that you'd like to get done? Is there a balance there?
The Cauldron is such a great tool. I would say 80% of the time, the Cauldron is driving performance. So I'm not going to interfere with a session. I'm just going to let them play. Doesn't mean I'm not saying some stuff from the sideline occasionally. But I would say 80% of it, I'm letting the environment drive performance and teach. And because I don't want to have them wasting their time not training, listening to me make an occasional instruction. Then in the 20% that's left, I am trying to instruct them while the event is going on. So even if nothing I'm sharing is getting through, at least the game is coaching them and the environment is driving them. So I would say 80 to 20, and the 20, I'm still not interfering with practice.
Sure. And then in that 20%, do you have a terminology that flows throughout your team's culture that allows you to coach very with brevity when you talk, or do you just kind of make those things up as you go? How does that look and work?
I have no issue with communication. So for me, it'll be short. It'll be right to the point. If I needed to have a point, sarcasm is a wonderful weapon. I use it obviously because it has a point, but also because it is funny, certainly to me, hopefully to the team, and occasionally even to the girl I'm lancing. But the nice thing about it is the girl will pay attention because I'm going to phrase it in a way that's going to force her to. So I use, every available tool I can to communicate in the most effective way. But I used to be a coaching instructor with U.S. Soccer and with the NSCAA. And the best way for someone to fail a coaching exam is to lecture. A lecture isn't training someone, and usually an inexperienced coach would try to show off his knowledge by demonstrating that he knew everything about the game. And that's not coaching a player. As you shared from quoting Training Soccer Champions, my first book, coaching is about effect. It's not about being right. It's about being effective. And so you have to find that conduit that's going to make you effective with each player, but also in every session.
Absolutely. And so Obviously, Anson, that's been a lesson you've been learning as you've been going on. Can you think back to maybe early on or even later in your coaching career about a low point for you when you were coaching and there was something that you did that was maybe a failure or maybe something that you mishandled that you can think of, if you don't mind sharing, that was a
Yeah.
great opportunity?
Yeah, the biggest mistakes I ever made was injuring players. And I just beat myself up. I'm thinking, well, I didn't organize this well, and this kid's pulled a muscle, I didn't warm him up properly, or something to do with an injury. For me, there's nothing worse than that. And this year is a great example. We had 5 ACL tears, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of why we had 5. And I think of all the issues I've had, injuries is what drives me absolutely nuts. Because you want to sort of have the players train on an edge, but you don't want them to go over the edge. You don't want them to be injuring themselves in training. So I would say the thing that frustrates me the most is when a player gets injured in my practice. Obviously not a collision injury, which you have nothing to do with as a coach, but either a hamstring pull, a quad pull, a groin pull, or an ACL, a non-contact ACL. So those are the things that absolutely cause me to be apoplectic, because now this wonderful kid that's entrusted to you now goes through the most horrific 9 months of rehab and out of the game. And it's just for certainly an ACL, it's just absolutely horrible. And for me, that's the absolute worst thing I could do.
Absolutely. And, just from kind of talking with you right now, it seems you have a deep sense of caring for every girl that you do get to coach. And that's obviously a very admirable quality. Is that something that's grown over time, or is that just how you're naturally wired? Can you kind of talk about, number one, where that comes from, and then number two, how you communicate that caring to your players?
Well, it has grown over time. One of my former players, a great player, one of the smartest players I've ever coached, her joke when I was a young coach was, if there was some sort of catastrophic injury on the field, before I had walked out to see how the player was doing, I already had a new lineup in my head. And she's absolutely right. I would have a new lineup in my head before I even walked out to approach the player. Even to this day, she teases me about everything, and she's a wonderful moral compass for me. But she was right. Originally, when I started coaching, players were chess pieces for me. They all had different strengths. The queen was worth 9 points. The bishops were worth 3. The horses were worth 3. The castles were worth 5. The pawns were worth 1. And so I had this sort of chess game mentality about players I was coaching, because for me, it was all about trying to win. Not that there were players I didn't like, of course. I mean, all of us coach kids that we like, even when I was a young coach. But the longer I was involved in coaching, the more I come to understand that what an incredible privilege it was to be with these extraordinary young men and young women, because for the first 13 years of my coaching life, I was coaching men. And so it was a privilege. And even now, I don't take this for granted. I love these kids. And now I have a completely different mindset than when I started. I go back and I see a lot of these kids I started coaching back in the original days. And I always say, have you recovered from the scarring, from my early couple years of coaching? And they all joke, and they all obviously are very nice to me. And I assume they've all forgiven me. But yeah, my evolution has been in this character area. I now absolutely know it's the most important thing I can do for the players I'm coaching. And it has transformed me. And I cherish my relationship with these wonderful kids. And I do everything I can to stay in touch with them. I love it when they come back to visit campus. I love it when their kids are looking at schools and we're recruiting their kids, because that's how I am now. Yeah, that's completely changed for me in the most positive way.
Absolutely. There's very cool. So finish this sentence for me, Coach. Coaching is?
Coaching is taking your athletes in a collegiate environment to their human potential as a priority, but also to their academic potential, because we're an academic institution, but also certainly their soccer and athletic potential.
Sure. And then I'll hit you with two more questions, and then we can go ahead and wrap up.
Okay.
Why do you coach? Of all the things you could have chosen to do with yourself, why are you coaching soccer?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's easily answered. When I was growing up, I love debating anything. In fact, sometimes you'll say something, I'll just go on the opposite side, even though what you've said is the absolute truth. I'll go on the opposite side just to try to drive you nuts, because I love the debate. And I used to have these debates with my dad when I was growing up, and he really felt like my calling was to be an attorney. So my dad was an oil businessman. He was starting his own oil company, and he had this dream for me about being his corporate attorney. The family humor at the time was, at least I'd have a tendency to steal from my own estate. So that was my dad's humor. Well, I love my dad, and I was a dutiful son, and I went to law school because that's what he wanted me to do. And to pay for law school, I got married before I got into law school. But to help pay for it, the coach I played for here at UNC was retiring, Dr. Marvin Allen. And he went in and told our athletic director, Bill Kobe, to hire me to be his successor. Marvin Allen was a physical education instructor here at the university, and he coached the men's soccer team part-time. So I was going to go to be a part-time soccer coach, coach the men I had played with, and then go to law school. And this was great. Everything worked out. I loved the coaching, and obviously I'm, again, finishing this law degree. Then all of a sudden I was taking a course shy each semester in order to coach, so I wasn't finishing in 3 years when most people finish law school. I was finishing in a fourth year. And the AD, the same guy that hired me, Bill Kobe, found me and said, Anson, I want you to come watch the local club team on campus, the women's soccer club, play. I want your opinion on them. So I'm out there with Bill Kobe, my athletic director, and watching this club team play. And he said, Anson, what do you think of this team? I said, they're not bad. Obviously, they're committed. They're well organized. He says, well, they petitioned me for varsity status. If I make your position full time, do you mind coaching them along with the men? And I said, no. By this time, I'd love coaching. And so here I am. I'm trying to finish my law degree in the fourth year. And I'm coaching two teams. I'm getting like 4 hours sleep at night. And I just couldn't do it. And finally, I came back home one evening and told my wife, honey, one of these three things has to go. And she knew what I was going to dump. So I dropped out of law school. That was absolutely the best decision I've ever made. I loved coaching, because by this time, I was, again, 4 years into my coaching platform, and I started to figure some things out a little. And I loved the game. I loved the kids I got to hang out with every afternoon. And so for the next 10 years, I coached the men and women together here at the University of North Carolina. And I have never looked back.
Awesome. And then the very last question I have for you is, how does it feel to be coached by you? What is that experience like?
I'm hoping it's a positive one. Basically, I wanted to design a program that I would want to play in. So I'm not really big on a lot of rules. If you look at the history of Christianity, the Ten Commandments were brought down from Mount Sinai because we failed to live the higher law. So they weren't brought down as the primary, principle-centered living instrument. They were brought down because we people weren't living the higher law. I absolutely hate rules. And so I've designed a program without rules. I want my kids to live principle-centered lives. I think living by rules and threats is no way to develop a human being. And so, again, we do everything with principle-centered living. So I've designed a program I would want to play in. And so I think I would really enjoy playing for me. I also absolutely believe in competition. And so obviously my training environments are competition. I want every kid to think they have a chance to play. So much so that I think people will be shocked at how many walk-ons get on the field for us here, and how many scholarship kids don't get on the field, because it's all about what happens in practice. And if you want to get on the field, get it done in practice. And so I think I would absolutely love playing in this program because I've designed it to be the sort of program I would love to play in.
Awesome. I think that's all really good, Coach. You shared some great stuff, and I'm very, very, very appreciative of it. I greatly enjoyed it. I hope that you got some value out of it as well. But that's all I have. I have to actually go coach doing basketball this evening. So I'm gonna go try to make that happen. But thank you so much again. If there's anything I can ever do to repay you, it would be my absolute pleasure.
John, it was enjoyable. I appreciated the interview, and obviously good luck to you.
Thank you. Take care, Coach.
Thank you.